Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah, ma ba'd. As we all know, Allah is created for a particular purpose, and that time is always going to end. There are different ways that it's going to end, there's going to be different times that it's going to end, but it's going to end. The conclusion for all of us is going to be exactly the same. And Allah Jalla wa Ala says in the Quran, أَيْنَمَا تَكُونُوا يُدْرِكُمُ الْمَوْتِ. Wherever you may be, death is going to catch you. وَلَوْ كُنْتُمْ فِي بُرُوجٍ مُشَيَّدَةٍ. Even if you were in a fortress, it will catch you. And some of the Mufassirun have asked the question, why is idrak mentioned here? Idrak means that it will catch you. Why is idrak mentioned? And the answer that they gave, may Allah have mercy on them, is that they've said that death is always going to catch you wherever you are, but the clever one is the one that he doesn't run away from death. He doesn't need it to catch you. He runs towards death, meaning he prepares himself. The Prophet ﷺ also said, Al-Kayyis, the intelligent person, the one who is wise and he knows his purpose and he is conscious, man dana nafsah, he prepares himself, he becomes ready, وَعَمِلَ لِمَا بَعْدَ الْمَوْتِ, and he prepares for himself for what is going to happen after. And we learn the obvious implication of this, where the Prophet ﷺ is saying that the person prepares for being questioned, but also we need to prepare ourselves, prepare our families, prepare our communities with what is going to happen to us individually. The last thing we need is to be confused when a person passes away, spiritually as well as legally. And that's why we thank MBCOL who have come today, agreed to come today and took out some of their Sunday afternoon to come and share what are some of the processes that every single one of us may need when we're here in Leicester, and for ourselves and for our families and for people who are related to us, etc. So ask Allah to reward them immensely and give them tawfiq and hidayah to give us the best of understanding and benefit us all, and that Allah rewards them Yawm al-Qiyamah for all of their efforts. So we have Uncle, elder in our community, I'm sure you are aware of him, Suleiman Nagdi, well-known personality in our community. He does a lot, and he does a lot of different efforts. And we have Brother Salim also, who works in the office, who will be able to give us the more legal and the admin side of it all. So ask Allah to give us barakah in our sitting here.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. First of all, we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for giving us the opportunity to sit together to learn about some of the important things Sheikh has just mentioned, but more importantly, at times of confusion, what individuals normally go through. And I'd say from the offset that no matter what we say today, I'm sure most of you will not remember totally, but even if you understand parts of it, at the time when you do lose a loved ones, inshallah, it will be there to make things a lot easier. We are hoping, inshallah, to do this in two parts. One is I will talk about the background, the structure, the existence of the Muslim Burial Council, and I will then pass on to Brother Salim, who is what we call cold-facing, an individual who works in the office continuously and is the first point of contact when somebody in the community passes away. And inshallah, he will take us through the structure, including the procedure that is needed when somebody passes away. It is important that what we talk about is an issue that will at some point affect us all, irrespective of where we are. Is that okay? People can hear me? Okay. Most of us are aware that within Islam there is... Can you hear? Okay. There is a requirement, a need to bury your deceased as soon as possible. Some commentators say within 24 hours, but as a general we say as soon as practically possible. And this is so important that these rituals and these rites are carried out according to the teachings of our faith. Historically, if we go back over 2 decades ago, when the Muslim Burial Council was first formed, there was a need within the Muslim community to ensure that the needs of the Muslim community were met and that burials could take place within a certain period, 24 hours. At that point, Monday to Friday, there was no burial facilities late in the evenings, Saturdays, Sundays, and bank holidays. So alhamdulillah, with the du'as of our elders and the efforts that many people had put through, we managed to sign the first historic document in Europe, allowing Muslims to access burial facilities 7 days a week, with an exception of Christmas and New Year's Day. And that started the ball rolling for the Muslim community in Leicester, but then became good practice, alhamdulillah, for the rest of the country. And not only for the rest of the country, but some of the work that I talk about, I have already spoken to some of our Muslim communities out in Europe. As an example, we had a tour from the Norwegians, who had a Muslim community there for about 40 or 50 years. The bodies were repatriated back to the subcontinent, and after seeing and hearing of what we do here, the city planners actually came down to Leicester, looked at the procedures, and alhamdulillah started the burial facilities in places like Sweden, Norway, etc. So alhamdulillah, Allah has given us the opportunity to serve the community, not locally, but nationally, and in some cases at a European level. And there's other issues that inshallah we'll talk about if time permits, even further afield. The Muslim Burial Council is a charity. It's been registered and it's accompanied by limited guarantee. It has at present 8, but it has up to 9 trustees that are elected by the masajids. MBCOL, in other words, is an umbrella body made up of its affiliates, which are other masajids, including other funeral arrangers, and they're the ones that are empowered to put the various people in the positions that they hold. The structure itself is an organization that was needed in the initial stages, because when we were approached the local authority to look at the issues of death and bereavement and how we can access burial services, we were asked that we were not mandated by the community, and how would you then be in an authoritative figure to ask for these facilities. So we had to form that structure in place, and that was so important, and that structure, like I said, has been repeated in other parts of the world. The difficulties that we faced was, of course, in relation to not only the burial facilities, but 80% of people that pass away in this country pass away in a hospital or old people's home or an institution of one sort or another. So, of course, we had to get permission and negotiated with the NHS Trust, the hospitals, for release of body, because you can have permission to bury, but if you do not have the actual body to bury, then this permission itself is not warranted in that case. What we also realized very quickly that within the legal system in this country, every person that passes away has to go through a registration process, i.e. when somebody is born, birth, marriages, and death. And the registration has to take place at the registrar. And again, we have to enter into special negotiation and agreements with the registrar's office to allow registration to take place on Saturdays, Sunday, with a window opening on bank holidays. And of course, from there we went and worked, of course, with the coroners, the police, and everybody else involved around the whole process. As time progressed, we started looking at other issues that affect the Muslim community, issues around repatriation of bodies, which we discourage, certainly from MBCOL's point of view. And the reason we discourage that is because bodies that are repatriated have to be prepared in a particular manner, i.e., example, that the blood is removed and embalming liquid is pumped into the body, and the body is then moved across to another part of the world. In many cases, the embalming liquid has traces of alcohol, and as we know within Islam, alcohol is prohibited, and then to pump alcohol or traces of alcohol in an embalming liquid to embalm an individual and send them abroad is also something that we speak out against, and we try to encourage people, but it is not our job as a Muslim Burial Council to tell people what to do. What we simply try to do is to try and make the situation whereby the facilities are there for the people, but it's up to the individuals. So we are a non-sectarian organization. We are not affiliated to a particular school of thought, particular faith, and we respect every school of thought. Our job is to help facilitate the burial of an individual, and if we agree or disagree on a certain point, we will move away and let the family and the massages continue. So we are not entering into the field of jurisprudence. Moving on, there is a lot of issues that I've raised in recent years in relation to what they call virtual autopsy. Most people are aware of it as MRI CT scanning, which is a facility that's available certainly here in Leicester and is available in other cities up and down the country. The facilities would have been open to us many years ago, but it's something that we disagreed in the extent of there was a charge to be placed. So, example, head was scanned or a body was scanned, an individual would have to pay for that, otherwise they'll have to go through the traditional autopsy. The difficulty with that particular structure that was suggested and that was picked up in other parts of the country was that there'd be a two-tier system. So those that could afford to do so would access virtual autopsy, and those that were poor and vulnerable in our community, of course, could not. And therefore, we believe the two-tier system was not good enough, and we wanted it to be across the board for every person, irrespective of their background. Therefore, it took a little longer in Leicester, and we were the first city in the country where the coroner and the coroner's office actually now pay for virtual autopsy if it's a preferred method, and not always guaranteed in the results, because there are early results of 83, 84%, up to 90%, but never 100%. Now, the way up between a post-mortem and a virtual autopsy or a CT scan, usually CT than MR because CT is cheaper, is the time span. For those that wish to bury earlier, then there are some of our scholars who say use that preference. Others say no, it's a discretion of body, and therefore wait for a couple of days longer and then go through the scanning process. But that is a decision left entirely in the hands of the individuals, in guidance, in accordance with the ulama and the scholars that they follow. It is, again, something that we do not enter into, but it is a facility that's available there for individuals. The cemetery, as most people understand now, on Saffron Hill is now filling up. We have, and Salim, inshallah, will go through the process of talking about the two types of graves and the depth of the graves for people that are buried, and that is to preserve the land. After that, local authorities may look for other land. We must understand that there is no legal requirement for local authorities to provide a burial ground. It is something that they usually do, and inshallah they will continue doing so. What I feel the best way forward for the Muslim community is to look forward and buy private land, which is something that the Muslim community owns, and therefore the restrictions that are normally applied to a local authority cemetery may not apply to us because it's our own private land. The difficulty is that land is premium within the inner city, so we have to now get used to moving out of the city boundary within Leicestershire and to look for land there, which is not simple because it has to be of a certain soil quality, it needs permission, it needs to have access from a road to the cemetery, and there are other restrictions around it. So inshallah, make dua that we do have a cemetery that belongs to us privately, but at the same time, if another one is provided for by the local authorities, then we would, of course, welcome that as well. As the challenges are moving forward, we notice that some of the issues that relate to us are issues that are of a national importance. So we were more or less part and parcel of forming a national burial council that is formed throughout the United Kingdom. And the idea of the National Burial Council is representation can be made to the Department of Justice, Ministry of Justice, Department of Health, in relation to various issues and legalities that are changing over time. If I may just draw on one as an example, a few years ago, the government through the European Union, the House of Lords, decided that we have what we call an organ donation card that individuals carry. Now, that organ donation card simply states that when I pass away, my organs can be harvested and be used for the next individual. Now, we objected to this many years ago, saying that the responsibility is put upon an individual family, and can you imagine the scene when somebody is actually passing away at hospitals and there's a dispute between family members, loved ones, and the person that's passed away. And so we refused on religious grounds that should be the default setting. However, in Wales, it changed, and in Wales it is now automatically that there's a consent that has been given when somebody passes away, that organs will be removed unless you register not to have your organs donated or harvested. In England, possibly towards the end of this year, new consultations will take place, and again the question has been posed once more again to say, that England should fall in line with some of the European countries and Wales as well, where there is an automatic assumption that organs will be given. And the chances are that law will pass. So people need to be aware that you may have to go to a central register for those that object to this. It's not for us to say whether you should give an organ or shouldn't give an organ. Of course, the obvious reasons are that for sale and etc., for science and etc., is not allowed. But in relation to save a life of another one or a loved one in the family, a kidney, etc., some scholars say it is, some it isn't. It is not for MBCOL to enter into that debate, but simply to make you aware that this is coming and this is legislation that's coming. Hence, the importance of forming a National Burial Council to address some of these new challenges that are coming forward. The challenges also are in relation to the burial land. Many years ago, I think up to about mid-70s, the burial ground that you used was given to you indefinitely. After the 70s, until 2 or 3 years ago, was given to you on a lease for 99 years, and now that's been reduced to 50 years, and eventually it might be even less than that. And so these are the challenges we'll face in the future, that grave could be dug and be used again, though there is an option, and I don't want to sound alarmist, there will be an option given to the person to extend it, but I think that extension will be limited to a certain time. After that, there will be a chance that the grave can be reused again. So these are some of the challenges I think we'll face going forward. There's issues around stem cell research and various other issues that we don't want to enter into today that will also give right for us to understand that this issue will affect us, our children, and children's children as years go by. So in a nutshell, we have to understand that gone are the days when the facilities that were open to us through the masajids, and this is very, very important issue that I wish to raise to you. We have 3 or 4 masajids in the city where most of the ghusl is taken place, and the support of the Muslims used to come from the masjids. They used to be done on a voluntary base, and Allah reward them all for those that have volunteered and given their time, but those people are now either aging or health is not permitting, and it's very hard now to get younger people to come and become volunteers to give their time. So the structures that we used to have 30, 40 years ago may not be fit for purpose as we are moving forward. As we're moving forward where there are dysfunctional families, people are working away from home, we have more professionalism within our community, there will come a time when people will want to ring one single number and let that individual or that organization take over everything from the time when death takes place right up to the burial, which includes the collection of body, the ghusl facilities, etc. And we've seen from our own experience through the Muslim Burial Council that over the last 20 years, certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, the demand on our services has been even greater than it ever was. And there's a time that we have to think. At the last AGM, a suggestion was put forward where I asked the membership that we wish to complement the already good service that they are providing in relation to the masajids, but in years to come, that will not be fit for purpose in relation to our community presently. Therefore, we need to think about moving into a different direction and professionalizing ourselves, and that way it will make things a lot easier. The difficulty with this, of course, is there have been some charges that will be levied against, which the masajis do anyway, what they call a service charge, and MBCOL would have to do that, because at the moment, the 8/9 trustees that form part of the Muslim Burial Council, people like us, are not paid. We do the work fi sabilillah, and that is because we believe that we need to serve the community. We only have one full-time worker who is inundated 7 days a week, calls at odd hours of the night and day, and sometimes one wonders how he even catches up with his family life. But Allah will reward you, inshallah, for all the extra time he gives. So it's not a 9 to 5 for that individual. Not only a matter of 9 to 5, sometimes a funeral can take a whole day because of complications, of release of body, of collection of body, etc. So it's only the person that's involved truly understands the challenges that they face. So we would have to move on to a paid system at some point. I do not mean paid in the sense of being a profitable organization, but one that at least covers costs, because we may have to bring in more volunteers, drivers, may even have to secure a building whereby we can do the ghusl, etc. It does not have to be a paid-off building, it can even be a rented building, etc. So we'll have to start thinking as we're going forward, and inshallah, whoever takes over from MBCOL, I think it's a challenge for them to see how they can continue providing that service. So today is not a sal of MBCOL, just to tell you that we have moved on and we've reached such a point of saturation that it is now becoming more and more difficult to look for volunteers in our community. And we don't blame them, because if people are working, we can't expect them to drop everything at a moment's notice, take time off the employer and go and help an organization. Though generally the volunteering in the Muslim community is second to none. We are one of the most generous communities when it comes for charity giving, etc. But we have to be practical about this as well, that the aging population and the younger generation coming in look at things or want things differently. So these are some of the challenges that we face. I'm aware of the time because I wanted to leave some time at the end, not to continue talking for a simple reason that there may be certain questions that you people may have, and that may be appropriate because we will enter the discussion at the level you want. But before we do any of that, I want to pass you across to Brother Salim, who is the office manager, and he will talk to you about all the difficulties and the challenges and the opportunities there is at a time when something like this happens. Not necessarily when death takes place, because we often hear in Islam, life after death, but there's life before death as well. And that's a time we need to think about life before death actually takes over and the procedure that follows it. So sometimes there are people who are seriously ill, people that are in hospices, etc., and what some of the challenges they face when their loved ones pass away suddenly or at a time of long illness. So I'll pass on to Salim, and he'll explain the practical issues that need to be taken place. We'll come back again, inshallah, and then take over in relation to questions and answers that anybody may have. Jazakallah.
Assalamu alaikum. As Sulman Bhai explained, I'm the only paid staff member of MBCOL, and I man the office, which is based on Moat Road, for those of you who know that it's only a stone's throw from this location. We provide burial support, funeral support, and so on when death takes place to families. We coordinate funerals. We assist in difficult situations such as coroner's cases or difficulties in body release and so on. Basically, we're there to provide or try and provide as much support as we can so that we can make the whole process of the funeral a little bit easier for the family and try and get things done swiftly so that burial can take place. My talk today is specifically on the funeral process, what's involved and so on, but it's broken down into two very specific scenarios. The first one is death within the institution. So we're talking about hospitals, hospices, care homes, and so forth. Sorry, not care homes, but hospitals, hospices, and so on. These are deaths within institutions which have a very specific process when it comes to issuing of documentation, body release, and so on. So looking at deaths within the hospital system, that's broken down into specifically expected deaths and unexpected deaths. So I'll take the expected deaths first. Now, the expected deaths are pretty straightforward. So when death is expected and when death actually takes place, the whole process is a lot easier because everything is in place. There are no questions as to the cause of death and so on. So the doctors treating the individual will know specifically what that person is suffering from and what it will eventually cause the death of that individual. So the acquiring of the main document in such a situation is the medical cause of death certificate. Now, it's usually referred to as the MCCD, but it's also referred to quite commonly as a medical cause. This is specifically issued by the doctor who is looking after the individual. Now, in a Monday to Friday kind of situation, it's quite straightforward. The doctors are working shifts of weekdays and weekends. So the weekday shift to acquire a death certificate would be pretty easy, especially if the death takes place during the early hours. That particular day, you can quite easily get hold of the doctor to get the death certificate issued. If death takes place towards the late afternoon or evening, perhaps the next morning at 9:30 when bereavement services opens, you'll be able to acquire the death certificate and have the funeral process begin. The difficulties in acquiring a medical cause of death certificate comes about when you have what we call a handover, which happens usually on a Friday evening between 7 and 8 o'clock. The handover means that the weekday shift of doctors will be going off-site, and the weekend shift will be coming on-site. Now, the reason why I bring this up is the law states that for any medical practitioner to issue a death certificate, they have to have treated that individual. And I mean treated, not just seen. It has to be treatment. So the weekend shift would need to be briefed on the fact that a specific patient is close to death and could pass away over the weekend. And in such a situation, we would need to issue a death certificate for the family to start the funeral process. So in these situations, it's always good to deal with the situation in advance, know what the problems might be. So come Friday afternoon, it's best to take up a conversation with the senior nursing staff in the ward to say, look, when the evening comes and the weekend shift comes in, they need to be briefed about my loved ones so that if something happens at the weekend, that specific doctor is in a position to issue a death certificate, legal position to issue a death certificate. Usually what happens is in these situations, the weekend shift, the doctor specifically treating that particular individual will make a visit and will go through the medical records and tick the boxes basically to allow them to issue a death certificate if something happens. So this is being proactive, and my advice quite often to families when they come to us to seek advice to say, look, somebody's in our family is coming close to death, and what should we be doing? This is the only thing in a hospital environment. This is the first thing I explain to them, that be mindful when it comes to the weekend, make yourself known, make the staff aware that we do have burials on weekends and bank holidays, and as long as we can get the medical cause of death certificate, we can start the process. Quite often, staff sometimes is unaware that we have burials at weekends and bank holidays. So they assume that if something happens at the weekend, come Monday, we'll be dealing with the necessary documents and so on. So it's always good to be proactive, make yourself known. There's no shame in actually speaking to the nursing staff. Sometimes families feel a little bit awkward talking about death, about a loved one, when that person is not yet passed away. You're actually, making life easier, or making things easier for them and for the family who will be dealing with the funeral process. So acquiring the medical cause of death certificate is the most important part. And in the hospital environment, on an expected death, you need to be mindful of, keeping ties with the nursing staff and the doctors, having very frank conversations with the doctors about issuing of documents if something happened, and be mindful of the handover when that comes at weekends. Weekdays is not so much of a problem, but be mindful at weekends and bank holidays, or approaching of weekends and bank holidays. In unexpected deaths, almost inevitably you will have delays. So whether you're in a hospital environment or outside the hospital environment, unexpected deaths will always attract the attention of the coroner. Now, even in a hospital situation, quite often we get families who come to us and say they've been in hospital for such a long time, and they were in and out of hospital, but why is there delay? Why is the coroner involved? The simple reason why the coroner gets involved is that we don't know what the person died of. So in a cancer situation, you're pretty sure that the person will eventually pass away of cancer or the problems that come on from cancer. Going in and out of hospital doesn't necessarily mean that that's enough justification for the documents to be issued. Very specifically, the medical cause of death certificate would need to state cause of death, what that person actually died of, and the medical terminology that the doctors would use, and the medical terminology that the registrars at the Register of Births and Deaths would accept. So quite often, not quite often, on occasion we do get medical cause of death certificates which are incorrectly completed or incorrectly state the cause of death. In these situations, the registrars reject it and would send you back to the hospital. So it's important that the cause of death is correct on the document. Now, in cases where there is some doubt about what that person died of, the medical practitioner, it would be illegal for them to actually, or it would be improper for them to actually put anything down. In these circumstances, what the practitioner would do, what the doctor will do, would be to say to the family, look, I'm a little bit unsure about what to put down as a cause of death. I would need to speak to the coroner. They will then go to a private room or whatever it is and have that conversation with the coroner to say, yes, I have been treating this individual. Yes, they have been in hospital for a while, or they've been coming and going, or they suffer from this, that, or the other. And I'm not sure, but I think it could be this that this person died from. The coroner would provide very specific guidance about when and what they can put down on a medical cause of death certificate. So the coroner will go through the medical records with the doctor, and if they can pin it down, they'll pin it down and then ask for the doctor to put that cause of death. They will then inform the registrars that this particular person has passed away of this particular thing, and when it comes to registration, it should be okay. Where the doctor and the coroner are unable to provide this kind of resolution, what normally happens is the coroner will then take charge of that individual and request for a post-mortem to take place. Now, Sulman Bhai already mentioned virtual autopsy. I'll mention very briefly that when the coroner issues an order for a post-mortem, the decision about whether it's an invasive autopsy or whether it's virtual autopsy is left to the pathologist to make, not the coroner. The coroner will just issue that particular order when the pathologist at the hospital receives the deceased and receives the medical records. He or she will then go through the records and make a decision whether or not an invasive post-mortem will take place or whether or not they could get away with imaging to ascertain a cause of death. Okay? So that decision is not to the coroner, because quite often, the reason I mention is quite often families come to us and say, look, can you have a word with the coroner? We're not interested in a post-mortem, or we're not interested in delays. So in these kinds of situations, the coroner is not the one that's responsible about making that decision. It's the pathologist. They're the qualified individual to make that decision. So that conversation would need to take place with the hospital. But besides that, you can't really argue on a faith practice, on a faith perspective that, look, Islamically we don't accept post-mortems or such things, and we need to have the body in our possession for a burial. They have to follow the law, and the law says if there's a question mark over the cause of death, you have to have an investigation. So there's coroner involvement. Assuming that you've got the death certificate, the rest of the process is pretty easy. You make an appointment with the registrar of births and deaths. You have the death registered with the medical cause of death certificate and the deceased passport. You go with those two items, make an appointment, have the death registered, and obtain a burial order. Your burial order is the document that we would require to get you a burial at Saffron Hill Cemetery. Okay? It's green in color. It's quite often referred to as the green, and in short, basically, the medical cause of death certificate allows you to take possession of the body. The burial order which the registrar gives you legal entitlement to bury that body. Okay, so while these things are going on about death certificates and so on, we have to understand that if you have your medical cause of death certificate, you're in a position to actually take the body out of the hospital. And you can do the preparations, ghusl, kafan, and everything else, but you can't actually bury that body until you have it registered. Okay? So, number one, just to recap, you need to get the medical cause of death certificate from the hospital. Number two, have the registration done. And number three, either visit MBCOL or go to the cemeteries department at Giro Cemetery to get the burial arrangements at the cemetery. And that's basically it. In between then, you make arrangements with the local mosque to collect the body, ghusl, kafan, take the body to a specific location or to the family home, and from there, when you've got your timing for the cemetery, you take the body to the cemetery for burial. Okay? So that's what we have in terms of deaths at institutions and so on. Now, we provide a lot of the support that Sulman Bhai has already mentioned in terms of assisting family get the documents, or perhaps getting the body released and so on. Even in the out-of-hours kind of scenario, we assist as well, and we have ways of making contact with relevant departments and individuals to do that. Obviously, it's better for the family to do that through the mosque or try and do it themselves, we are very limited in our resources, and there's only so much we can do, but we do our best to do that anyway. The second part of that is deaths which are not in the hospital environments, which we call community deaths. So deaths that take place at home or a care home and so on. Majority is deaths in a home, the family home. In these kinds of situations, what you have to do is you have to acquire the same documents, but you have to do it in a different way. So where you would get in a hospital, go to the doctor or bereavement service to get the medical cause of death certificate. For a death at home, you can only get it from the family GP or the deceased's GP. So you have to go to the doctor's surgery, inform the doctor that this person's passed away, and that you would need to get a medical cause of death certificate. Again, the doctor will make those checks whether or not that person was expected to pass away. If they were, that would be reflected in the medical records, and they would then issue a cause of death certificate, and you move on to the registration and so on to the rest of the process. Again, the same rules apply if the doctor is unsure about what that person was suffering from and whether or not that illness could be a cause of death. They would have that conversation with the doctor, with the local coroner. Again, the same conversation takes place, and then they will try and ascertain whether or not a cause of death can be put down. If not, you go through the same process where you have to go to the coroner, get an update, and the coroner follows through with their procedure. In situations where we have individuals who are coming end of life within the community setup, the advice we give very clearly is if the person has been sent home from the hospital, quite often what happens is care takes place at the hospital. When it comes to a situation where there's nothing the hospital can do, the hospital will say to the family, look, there's nothing we can do, take the person home and make them as comfortable as possible and let them live out their time, whatever remaining time they have within the home. That's the usual thing. It'll be similar for the GP's kind of advice that they give. In these kinds of situations, as soon as the person arrives at home, the first thing that you need to do is get in touch with the GP and say, look, this person has been sent home, and can you please come home and make a visit? Now, if you remember going back, I said the only person who can issue a death certificate is the local doctor or the doctor treating that individual. So there's a rule that we call a 14-day rule that applies. Basically, that practitioner has to have seen an individual within 14 days to allow for them to legally sign off on that death, if they know what the cause of death is. If it's too far gone, then it makes it more difficult for that GP to issue a death certificate. So it's important to get things done quickly. As soon as the person comes home from the hospital, contact the GP and ask them to make a home visit. Ask them to come and visit the person at home, see the individual, tick the boxes, go away. If something happens, you can contact the GP. Legally, the GP is then entitled to sign off. It is wrong for us to impose on the GP or argue with the GP to say, look, just sign off, and it's not. It's not. They could lose their license for practicing medicine. And it wouldn't be appropriate for us to do that. So contact the GP, ask them to make a home visit. There are certain allowances if the GP was unable to visit the person at home. There are certain allowances. And those allowances very quickly are that for that GP, if it's outside the 14 days, the GP can still issue, but the GP would have to go to the mortuary, view the body, have a word with the coroner, and then sign off. If it's too far gone, so it could be a few months, even that doesn't apply. They have to have a direct conversation with the coroner and come to some sort of arrangement if the coroner permits. So those are the kind of situations that we have within the community and community deaths. For care homes, it's quite straightforward. The care home doctor who's looking after the residents would be involved, or their own GP would be involved. Again, same kind of setup. Coroner, the GP would need to be contacted, issue a death certificate, go to registration, and get the burial done. So we've covered the community deaths more or less. There's one other kind of situation that we need to cover, and that's to do with infant deaths. We have roughly 20 to 30 infant deaths a year in Leicester. These are infants up to a year old, and it could be anything from 16-week gestation right up to a month old or full 9-month pregnancies. Where we have deaths of infants, the threshold where legalities apply is 24 weeks. So if a woman is carrying a child which is 24 weeks and above and passes away after the 24th week, then all the legalities apply. Islamically, you would need to speak to your ulama about what formalities apply from an Islamic perspective. But from a legal perspective, 24 weeks is a threshold. After 24 weeks or above, all the legalities apply. So you have to get the death registered. You would have to have all the documents in place for the burial to take place. If it's below 24 weeks or below, then the formalities don't apply, which means you can go to the hospital, pick up the baby, pick up a 3-part form, which is a very simple document, come to us and we'll arrange a burial. No registration, none of that. Okay? So we've covered infant deaths as well. In terms of the cemetery then, we have a couple of grave options that we have. We have two, in the new section, we have 2 very specific sections. One is what we call the traditional section, which is in the Islamic sense, not the, in the English sense, not the Islamic, and what we call the lawn section. The traditional section is roughly about 5 to 10% in terms of space area, and the 95% is the lawn section. The lawn section is very specific. It's basically turfed land with facilities for a headstone. That's it. In the traditional side, we have facilities for plants, shrubs, monuments, memorials, including curb sets, edgings, and so on. The price difference between the two is the traditional is double the price of the lawn, specifically because you have more allowances there, so the grave costs a little bit higher. The cost for a lawned grave is 1,235, and the price for a traditional grave is 2,320. So those are the 2 grave options that we have in terms of allocation in a specific section. When it comes to actual burials, we have 2 methods of burial. We have one which is with a coffin, one without a coffin. We have had the coffin and without a coffin burials for a very long time, mashallah. In Leicester, MBCOL worked very hard in the very beginning to allow us to be given that option. And in terms of burial then, the default setting for a burial with a coffin is the graves are dug at a standard 7 to 7.5 feet. That's with a coffin burial only. That burial also comes with an option for the family. If they wanted to have a second burial in that same grave from that same family, then they could potentially have one. There's no imposition from the council to say you have to. It's an option. If you wanted to, you could have 2 burials in one grave, so long as the first burial is done in a coffin, because it will go at 7.5 feet. The burial without a coffin is only dug for one, and that depth is 4.5 feet. Because of health and safety reasons, the family members actually have to enter the grave to lower the deceased in the coffin onto the floor of the grave and then do the necessary adjustments there. Because members of the public have to enter the grave, the limitation is 4.5 feet for health and safety reasons. They can't do an 8 foot or 7.5 foot burial without a coffin. So 2 options, lawned or traditional. Each burial has, again, 2 options on top of that for burial, with a coffin, without a coffin. With a coffin is standard 7.5 feet, with an option of a second burial if you wanted one. The burial without a coffin is at a single depth of 4.5 feet, 1 per grave. Okay. So in terms of cemetery options, we have that. In terms of what's coming forward, very quickly for another 5 minutes, in the next couple of years, we have a new system that will be coming into play, and that is the role of the medical examiner. Now, if you recall Dr. Harold Shipman, some years ago, he basically killed off quite a few of his patients because there were no checks or balances made on what he was doing. A lot of changes have come about since then, and the medical examiner and his role is part of those changes. And basically his role will be to scrutinize every death that occurs within their jurisdiction. and they will basically glance at the records, glance at the cause of death, basically do what the doctors and the registrars do at the moment, but before you get to the registration. If you remember when I said sometimes if the medical cause has got an incorrect cause of death, then the registrar rejects it. The medical examiner will pick that up before you get to that stage. And they will also make a system a little bit better, hopefully. But it comes with problems itself. There are expected delays in acquiring the documents. We are working very, very closely with the hospital. We had a meeting just a couple of weeks ago with the medical examiner and some members of the hospital system, UHL system, to work around early release of bodies for the Muslim and the Jewish community primarily. It'll be open to all faiths, obviously, but they're hoping that the new system developed within the next couple of years, by the time it kicks in, it's not just in Leicester, by the way, this is national, by the time it kicks in, will actually work just as good as the system works at the moment. Okay, we won't make promises of it being better. There will be some delays. We'll have to be patient about these things. But these are all things that are set in law. So there's nothing that we can really do about it. What we can do is actually work with the system and try and make things as easy as possible. Hopefully the transition won't be a swift one. It'll take time, and it will kick in eventually, inshallah. I know you won't retain a lot of the information that I've said. It's very difficult anyway. But a lot of the stuff that we've discussed and talked about right now, you can get through the MBCOL website. We have specific pages with all the information that I've covered. I've probably skipped a few bits and pieces or missed a bit. But you'll find a lot of in-depth information on our website. Please visit it. It's www.mbcol.org.uk. You'll also get it through, if you have the app, the MBCOL app, there are pages within the app that you can have access to for information for quick references. And we also have leaflets, which some of them I've brought today with me. Please take one with you, or take as many as you like. They're for free. If you want more, then you can come to MBCOL and pick them up from there. It explains very briefly what the processes are and what you need to do, inshallah. We're always around anyway. As Sulman mentioned, we're only phone call away. The office at MBCOL at Moat Road has out-of-hours numbers and in-hours numbers on the front. So should you encounter difficulty, you can get the number from there or the website. Give us a call, inshallah. We'll try and provide as much assistance as possible, inshallah. Jazakallah.
I'll just recap one or two things very quickly. I'm aware that Asad Salah will be upon us very quickly. So it's important, these 2 or 3 things, and just to expand on 1 or 2 points that Brother Salim has made. One, he talked about the 14-day rule that applies. We have made representation to the Ministry of Justice to see whether we can extend the 14 days to 28 days or even beyond that. But unfortunately, at the moment, Brexit is taking over all of government's time. So these discussions are not being fruitful. The idea is it sometimes takes 2 weeks just to see a family doctor. So if it's only 14 days, how would you get the doctor to come down? So that is in the pipeline. The other issue that is commonly a difficulty for the Muslim community, and quite rightly so, but we need to understand the rules and regulations governing it, is this issue about when the coroner will get involved. Usually, if it's anybody who is under the age, a child under the age of 18, the coroner will be informed. That does not necessarily mean a post-mortem will follow. Post-mortems are only followed when a cause of death is not determined, but there are other cases where post-mortems would be done. Example, in the case of suicide, then post-mortem will be done. If somebody dies in a road traffic accident, it would. Now, somebody would simply say that in a road traffic accident, as an example, we know it was a relation of the accident that took place, but we have no idea that the driver could be under the influence of drink or drugs, or the driver could be in his full faculty, but the person sitting along him who had died could be an act of criminality, could have been killed somewhere. The body was transported to another place, and an accident took place, and both died. So there's a criminal investigation in one and the other. When it happens at home, when the paramedics turn up, example, the ambulance, we normally ring 999, and the paramedics come up, they will give you a death certificate, not a cause of death. They'll simply say that life is extinct, it is not in that particular person, and the body has to be removed. If the person passes away while they are in attendance, while they are in the ambulance, while they arrive at accident emergency within the first 24 hours, then there is a medical negligence case that has to be answered. So the coroner would be informed. The chances are a post-mortem would take place because they have to see whether the appropriate medication was given to that individual. The same thing will apply if you're in hospital, say, for 3 days, you had an operation and you pass away from that. Again, the coroner will be involved to make sure that the operation was carried out correctly, because sometimes there are cases where surgeons also make a mistake. So there are medical negligence cases that have to be answered for, and we need to understand some of the difficulties. It could be through industrial poisoning, it could be asbestos, it could be a number of issues. So we need to understand that these are there for the safeguard of individuals. It could also mean that the person who passed away at home could have eaten something, and as a result of eating that something, there may be a danger to the other family members in the house, hence why they do it. So we need to understand it more broadly. We should not look at the tree, but look at the forest. There's a bigger picture out there, why these rules are put into place, in order that people can fully understand that it's to safeguard individuals. Sometimes we may not like it, but it's unfortunately this is the way the law applies. Usually people would say, and this is quite common in our community, everybody knows an uncle, knows somebody who has the contacts, who has the influence. You know, forget what MBCOL say, or forget what Salim is saying. I know somebody, let's ring the coroner. Believe me, you cannot put pressure on the coroner. A coroner has the power of a High Court judge. They are not subject to any political pressure, whether it's a member of parliament, whether it's a councillor, because their position is as a High Court judge. Their appointment is by the Crown from London, so nobody local. So this uncle idea that we have in the back of mind, let's ring out all over town and somebody will help us out and will do it, does not work. In fact, all it does is impedes and makes this process a lot slower, because people do not quite understand the process, because we come from different parts of the world. We have had different life journeys. For those that came from the Asian subcontinent, North Africa, Arab countries, and twice migrants, etc., would revolve and go back to their own way of how they did it back home, but things are different here. So we need to understand that there's a certain protocol that has to be followed. That's important. In some cases, you'll find that tissue samples are removed and the body is given to the individual. There may be slides. For those that may remember Alder Hayes organ retention scandal that took place many years ago, where organs of children were not put back into the bodies of babies, and the whole scandal broke out through the country. So the laws governing even tissue samples, etc., is very strict now, and if they do remove any tissue samples, it can take anything from a week to 6 weeks, for the tissues to be returned back to the family. What we generally tell people, if the body is given to the individual, you bury the body in that particular grave, and then if the tissue samples are given, you just dig a side of the grave, in the same grave, and you leave the tissue samples there. And again, there are very strict rules governing around the issues of organ retention, etc. There's a bit of a difficulty, I don't know if there's sisters upstairs, but certainly when it comes to a child, then the trauma is a lot greater in relation to the post-mortem and what actually takes place. And I don't want to go into the details of it now, because for many people that may have lost a loved one or recently lost a loved one, all those memories will flow back again. But we need to understand that it may not always be appropriate. There are other issues around infection control that we have to be mindful about. If there's bloodborne diseases, etc., and for those that are performing ghusl, we'll have to take the necessary precaution in wearing gloves, example, aprons, to make sure that, and the things are not discarded in the domestic refuse, like example, the house bins, but they are properly disposed of, etc. But these are things that I'm sure we'll get to, and we can continue with the subject for the next hour or so, but I don't think it will achieve anything, except that we'll remember some of it and the rest will be forgotten. I think what would be more appropriate is to give people an opportunity, with the permission of the chair, to ask them that if they have any questions, we will try to answer them, and if we don't know, we'll come back to you, because we don't have answers to everything. That would be quite arrogant of us to even assume that. So we'll try the best to try and answer any questions that you have, and if we don't, we will find out about those questions and come back to you, inshallah. So I think we'll open up the floor. Is that okay?
Allah reward you both, and I'm sure it's been very beneficial. But just as a summary, just to summarize everything, if somebody passes away and the death happened under the care of a doctor or in hospital, then it's pretty much straightforward. They get a death certificate, and we bring that death certificate to the registrar, and then the registrar then to MBCOL, and we can get everything done very quickly, if it's a weekday. Yeah?
That's right. However, we must understand one thing as well, that there is a big turnaround in staff in the NHS.
Okay.
So not every medical practitioner would have the necessary experience, and they're not all told. So what we normally tell them is, they should look on what they call the intranet, not the internet, the intranet, the internal net system that they have. And we have already provided guidelines for hospitals what to do when a Muslim passes away, which also includes to remind the patient's loved ones that, example, the nursing staff must remove the tubes, the needles, etc., the shutting of the eyes, the binding of the jaw, with maybe a bandage, the hands to the side, the legs put together, etc., while the body is still warm. So these guidelines are already there, and if people forget, then the guidelines have been provided to the hospital. So yes, under normal circumstances, what you have said is right, but there's always an exception to the rule where the person could be somebody new, and so we have to, again, remind them that these facilities are already in place and these arrangements have already been made between the Muslim community and the hospitals.
So if it's straightforward. Sorry.
Yeah, just to note, the guidance on the intranet is actually for body release. Certification is a different matter altogether, and every medical practitioner, the doctors in the hospital, guided with the bereavement services, would know what their parameters are for issuing death certificates. So if you're having difficulties in terms of getting the body released from the hospital, once the death certificate's been issued, then you would speak to us or speak to the nursing staff to say, look, there are documents on the intranet with respect to body release.
So that's if it's during the weekday. If it happens in the evening, we have to wait till the next morning.
Yes.
And if it happens in the weekend, then it possibly Monday.
Possibly, if you don't have the weekend shift of doctors who are legally entitled to sign off, because they may not have had time to actually look at the records, see the patient on the ward, and make themselves qualify to sign off. Yeah. Then you have a situation where you have to wait till Monday.
Right. So.
But again, if it's on a Saturday and you manage to get the papers, just before, say, about 9, 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, if you inform MBCOL, we can contact the registrar who has that window opening of 2 hours. But say if it's Sunday afternoon, then the registrar is not on call anymore. It automatically goes on to Monday. So it just depends. Every case depends on whether... The one thing you have to remember that we go over and over again, you have to secure the cause of death certificate before the whole process starts. If you don't have a cause of death certificate, nothing happens. That's the first thing and the only thing you should concentrate on when a loved one passes away. I need that cause of death. Once you've got that certificate in you, not a death certificate, a cause of death certificate. Because death certificate can be issued by the paramedics also. They don't know what the person passed. So a cause of death certificate is crucial. Once that is in their hands, alhamdulillah, everything will fall into place. Which even means sometimes going to the doctor's surgery, your family GP, and being a nuisance and being there with the reception and say, I must say the doctor, I must get this cause of death certificate because it's delaying matters for me. So be it, if that's what you have to do.
I'm sure everybody wants Islamic burial and they want to get it done very quickly. So this is very important information that we need to get the death certificate done so we can get the registrar done. And if this is within normal working hours, we can normally even get the janazah done in the same day. And it's very, very possible. But if the person hasn't died under care, they're not in hospital, it's a spontaneous death, like you said, a car accident or something, then it becomes more complicated and they have to go through the post-mortem scenario. So how long would that delay?
In normal circumstances, if you had death that was referred to the coroner will automatically tell you that it could take up to 3 days. Now, the reason why they say to you it could take up to 3 days is that in case the pathologist, if you remember when I talked about the pathology side of things, the post-mortems and the imaging side, the pathologist makes a decision of whether to do an invasive autopsy or whether to use a scan. So they will tell you the outside time frame, which is 3 days. Because if it's a virtual autopsy, if it's a scan that they have to do, they have to get the scan done. Then they have to get a radiologist to read the data from the scan, turn it into a report and feed it back to the coroner. All of that takes 2 to 3 days. If it's an invasive autopsy, which is basically, you go on the table and they do an invasive, then that can be turned around within 24 hours. But an invasive autopsy, you have to remember, has to be ordered on a working day for it to take place the next working day. So if a death takes place on a weekend and it falls under the care of the coroner, the conversation between the hospital and the coroner won't take place till Monday. So if it's then assumed that Monday the coroner says, I'm sorry, it's going to have to be a post-mortem, they will order it on Monday and it will take place early Tuesday morning. So there has to be ordered on the working day for it to take place the next working day. No post-mortems or scans are done on a weekend or a bank holiday. It's only Monday to Friday.
And the other issue is, say if somebody passes on a Friday evening, Saturday and Sunday, of course there's a backlog of bodies. So they have to do it in order again. So it depends exactly. When it comes to Friday, Saturday and Sunday, it can become a bit complicated and there may be a delay. So we must be prepared for that delay, and inshallah we hope that it works out a lot quicker than it happens. So these are some of the factors that we have to take into account.
For that clarification, may Allah give us all a good end with firmness and iman, and be pleased with us and make our passing from this life easy, and give our families patience and steadfastness when we all pass away. Let's open the doors, the floor for any questions for those there.
هذه التجريح هل هي واجبة على كل يعني ميت أو في الحالات التي فيها suspicion فهمت أو هل يأخذ شيء من بدنه أو تشريح أو شيء؟
He's asking as a question. I think he wasn't there when you actually talked about it in the lecture. But he was saying that is a post-mortem binding on every single death, or is it just for injuries, or what is the scenario when does a post-mortem need to take place?
A post-mortem is only ordered when the doctor who treated the individual is unable to put down a cause of death, or the system can't recognize what that person died of. In these situations where there's a question mark over the person's death, the matter will automatically be referred to the coroner. This is the reason why they do a post-mortem or the scan, to actually open up the body, to actually find out what went wrong within that individual, for them to then, the pathologist to then put down a cause of death. So any death where there's a question mark over the death, that the person, we don't know what the person died of, there could be an illness, it could be a non-illness, it could be an accident, it could be suicide. I mean, even in suicide, Allah protect us all from these situations. We've come across the odd one where, there were mental health issues and so on involved. And it's very apparent what that person died of, but automatically there will be a post-mortem because they don't know what the circumstances were internally, chemically, and so on. So any death where there's a question mark, the coroner will automatically be involved.
If I can give you one example, brother. If somebody dies of pneumonia, as an example, now say there's an individual, a man or a woman, who had a fall, and because they could not move, were bedbound. So the primary reason was the fall. As a result of the fall, pneumonia took over, so they died of pneumonia. So they may go back to the accident. If somebody never had a fall and just died of pneumonia, it's a different set of circumstances. So a lot depends on that individual and the set of circumstances surrounding any particular death that will determine whether a coroner will become involved or not. For us, it will be very simple. You died of pneumonia, but did something lead to the pneumonia, or was it just pneumonia that they just picked up? So these are the two things we have. That's just a sort of an example how it becomes more complicated sometimes.
And with the post-mortem, it could be the same day that the body is released, if it's straightforward, or it could take 3 days.
Exactly.
No, post-mortems, as I said, have to be ordered on a working day.
Yeah.
So if somebody passed away, say on Monday morning, it's unlikely that that post-mortem will take place on Monday, regardless of what time the death happened.
Okay.
It has to be ordered on a Monday, because post-mortems at the hospitals happen at very early hours of the morning. Okay, so about 6 onwards, they start doing the post-mortems, and they're normally done by 8, 9 o'clock, so for the pathologists or the doctors to do their rounds in the hospitals. So the pathology is done very early on any working day. So in order to get that body into the theatre, it has to be ordered the day before, so that they can actually put it on the schedule for the next morning. In extreme circumstances, if there's, for example, multiple deaths, or terrorism, or questionable deaths, then the coroner will exercise their powers to actually order post-mortems on a normal routine day, emergency, weekends even. Post-mortems can take place in those kinds of situations. But normal deaths in our normal sort of day-to-day lives, it normally has to be ordered on a weekday to be done on the next working day.
So what Brother Salim is actually saying, it depends on individual or mass fatalities. Allah forbid, say there was a multiple dirty bomb that went off and a whole number of people died. You couldn't take the people to hospital because you contaminated the whole hospital as well. So that will be mass burial or mass cremation. Or there could be a pandemic and hundreds of people could die. You couldn't wait and store up the bodies. In that case, the coroner has special powers, to then release bodies. But those are really very exceptional circumstances. Possibly, Allah forbid, never happened. But if it did, that's in the background. But that has put more complications around it and would not be relevant, I think, for an everyday person.
Okay, so just to summarize that point, so if a person passes away, say, on a Sunday, he first has to get booked in for a post-mortem. That'll be the next working day, Monday. Once he's booked in, it could be Tuesday, might be even later.
If it's a scan, it'll be later.
Yeah.
If it's an invasive autopsy, you'll get a release on Tuesday.
Okay, so say, for example, earlier stage, Tuesday, they could keep it for 24 hours, possibly another 3 days after that.
No. If it's ordered on a Monday, if the pathologist knows about it by Monday,
right,
he will do the pathology on Tuesday morning.
Right.
If it's an invasive, which means they dissect the body,
right,
then you'll get the release on Tuesday afternoon.
Okay.
If the pathologist decides that it's going to be a scan, then it could be Wednesday or latest Thursday.
Right. Okay. So do they have working hours for the post-mortem? Because I know that the bereavement services have working hours.
Yes.
So if a person passes away 4 o'clock on a Monday, it's very likely that you'll get your death certificate on a Tuesday because their working hours for the bereavement services on a Monday afternoon finishes about 5 o'clock.
Yes.
So is that the same for post-mortem? So if a person has passed away at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, by the time they get to hospital and everything, could it be that their booking in for post-mortem will be made on a Tuesday, so they'll have to actually wait for Wednesday for...
That's right.
That's right.
That's right. Because it's not just a matter of just picking up the phone for the coroner and order a post-mortem. What normally happens is if there's a question mark over the death, the coroner will need to speak to family members, find out exactly what the circumstances were before that person passed away. How were they feeling? Did they complain of any specific thing? Did they fall? Did they hurt themselves? Were they complaining of something? So all of these things are taken down by the coroner for the pathologist to look at. Once all of that information is recorded by the coroner will make a decision about post-mortem or not. Obviously, they've looked at medical records and so on. So all of that information is taken in by the coroner. That takes time. So it's all well and good. We say, okay, fine. No, it's a working day. It's 2 o'clock. That person's passed away. You have to remember that that person passed away at 2 o'clock or even 12 o'clock. By the time the paramedics come, they take the body away. By the time the coroner gets in touch with the family, all of these things take time. It could take a good few hours. So it could be that you'll meet 4 or 5 o'clock of the working day for the postmortem to be ordered the next day. Chances are it's going to go to the next day.
Okay.
Part of my question is,
Sure.
you don't have to answer if you don't want.
Fine.
Will they be able to take a part of the body?
In certain
Let me
situations.
just repeat the
Okay.
question because it's
Okay.
can they take the organs out?
Can they, by law, are they allowed to take away part of the body?
But legally, are they allowed to take part of the body without consent of the deceased and the deceased family, or maybe with consent? What are the parameters for that?
In terms of organ retention or tissue sample retention, if there are certain things that require further testing, okay, let's say for example it's a young person who's passed away, not expected, sudden death, but if it's a young person under the age of 20, so definitely 18 and below, but under the age of 20, then the coroner will automatically remove organs for retesting. Okay? They will require organs. In infants' deaths, almost definitely. So be mindful of that. The reason for that is that when they test organs, sometimes they can find illnesses which are hereditary, which are in the family. No one's picked it up yet because you don't really go and test for all sorts of things. But if somebody passes away and they retain these organs and they would send them off for testing, sometimes they then pick up illnesses that will help the siblings or will help the family to seek medical attention or medical assistance. Do you understand? So there are certain things that they can sometimes pick up. So this is why they take organs and test. But to answer your questions, yes, they can if they want to, within a certain age. The law states that for infants and for people under the age of 20, definitely under the age of 18, they will, if they want to, need to take organs, they will take them. They will they will advise you of the situation, but you will have to sign off to say yes, take them. In most cases, if especially infant deaths, they will do a fast track and return the items as quick as they can. The fastest they've retained organs is about 6 days to a week, 5 to 7 days. The most it can take is 6 months. But all of these things are documented, of where they go, when they've gone, who's taken them, and how they make their way back. So there's no fear of loss for those items. None of them will get mislaid. Everything is done very, very clinically. When the items are returned, as Sunmanbai explained earlier, the family is advised that these items have been returned and are ready for collection. We will then help the family to collect those items and repatriate them with the original burial. So where the individual was originally buried, we would send the family to the same grave, or we will help them. We will then excavate part of the foot of the grave, place those items inside, and backfill them, so that all the items are within one grave space.
Sorry, I'm looking after my mom. She's quite old, and I'm on my own. All my family is abroad, and I miss part of the.
Sure.
Yeah. What can I do to make your job easy? For example, what is the couple of things that you require? Because if I'm on my own, I'm thinking, there's a lot of procedures from my point of view. So what can I do so that you can help me as much as possible? You said cause of death?
Yeah. Let's get to that.
Okay, so the question is asking now, mother is ill and he's by himself. What are some of the preparations that he can do in order to get ready for his mother's death? May Allah preserve her and extend her life. If the sisters have any questions, they can send a text message to 07535 650 226. That's 07535 650 226. We'll try our best to get that answered for you.
The best thing you can do is actually pick up the phone and talk to him. That's the best advice I can give you. Regardless of whether it's weekend or weekday, up to a certain point, even early evenings, sort of within reason, if you have difficulties or you need to have some answers, by all means, pick up the phone, speak to me. Our numbers are in public circulation. You can get them off our website and so on. And I'll ask you a few very basic questions about where your mother might be, what she's suffering from, how long she's been suffering, and so on, to build a picture about what that individual's circumstances are. And then I'll give you the best advice that I can give you. If your mother is at home, then the care that you can provide is different, or the precautions you need to take are different. If your mother is in a hospital institution, again, the advice I would give you would be different. So I would need to speak to you for a few minutes to get you to get all that information, and then I can give you the best advice. I would suggest to you personally, after the session's finished, perhaps I can cover those bits, inshallah. But the primary thing is that you need to speak. Get in touch with me. Secondly, just in brief, you need to speak to the doctors, whether they're the GP, local GP, or the hospital doctors, about if something happens to your mother, how quickly they can issue a medical cause of death certificate or make that situation happen so that you can start the whole funeral process. But the main document you need is a medical cause for the start the process.
Sorry, second quick question. I've got friends who tell me that sometimes I don't go to the doctors for months, like 3-4 months, and they keep telling me, no, take her to the doctor. I said, why?
You have to.
Look, if something happens to her, like I said, there's nothing wrong. You still want me to take her? So I told the doctor one day that, do you want me to bring her here or what? And he didn't answer me, so I don't know what to do sometimes.
I think it's safer to, especially when you know that she's getting to a certain point, is to even the doctor just to see her. Like Salim said, 14 days. They can't push it beyond that. You see, there's no hard and fast rule. Let me give you one quick example. Our coroner, Kathy Mason, she's a brilliant coroner that we have. Previous coroner was a bit more difficult. Kathy Mason comes from a medical profession. She was a nurse, and then she became a solicitor. She became a coroner. She has reduced post-mortems by 42% in Leicester, simply by changing the work ethics of doctors. So, example, when the doctor says, I don't know what the person died of, because they always want to play it safe, report it to the coroner. Our coroner turns around back to the doctor and says, turns the story around and says, you tell me why you can't sign a cause of death certificate. So the doctor's got to work a bit harder, go through the medical records and everything else. So we are fortunate in Leicester that our coroner is a lot more easygoing and helpful. That's not to say that they will bypass the rules, but they make them work differently. But if you hear about coroners in Birmingham, as an example, it's a total different subject. So some cities are fortunate, and the relationship that's been built is easy and better, and in some places it's far more difficult.
So would you advise me to take her to the doctors frequently?
When you've got an elderly mother now, it could be that you have, inshallah, you do. She's fairly healthy. She's not suffering from any illnesses which are life-threatening. Right. If your situation is that the person you are caring for is suffering from life-threatening illnesses, then you need to take precaution. Okay, if the individual doesn't have life, it could be, some people just remain ill a lot of the time. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's life-threatening. We don't want to inundate our GP surgeries with additional unnecessary bits and pieces of work. So if your loved one is in a situation where the illnesses they are suffering from could take their life, then you need to take my advice seriously, which is visit the GP regularly. Within 14 days, make sure that the GP visits. Okay? If it's not that situation, then you don't need to stress so much. Okay. Because if she's not suffering from anything which is life-threatening, if something does happen to her, Allah protect her, but if something does, then she'll automatically fall under the category of a questionable death, where they don't know what the cause of death is, which will follow through with the coroner system.
Before we take the next question, talking about the organ donation process, we've got Sheikh Faisal Manju, who's going to come after Salatul Asr, so that's 2:45, and he's going to talk about things that we have to, how to write the will and the most important bits that you need to put in the will, and this is one of those things that he's going to address, inshallah. My brother had his hand up there. Yeah.
In terms of the grave, you've explained the cost, but is there any additional cost involved? Like releasing certificates and going to register and all of that. Is that total?
Are there any additional costs?
There is. I'll let Salim give you that information. But just one thing, just in case he slips his mind, the charges we are giving in relation to the figures was Leicester City. If you are living in Oldby, then you are outside the city limit. It goes double the amount, and the reason it goes double the amount is Oldby doesn't have a Muslim section of the cemetery. But what the Oldby authorities do is pay 1,000 towards yours to make it a bit easier for you. So you must remember where you are. If in the city boundary, those are the figures. If in the county, it's slightly more. So that is in relation between Oldby and Leicester. Loughborough is different because they have their own cemetery. And Salim would explain all the other charges.
In terms of the issuing of documents, it doesn't cost anything. Okay, so to get hold of your medical cause of death certificate, to get the burial order and so on, it doesn't cost anything. Even to come to the MBCOL office or to go to Gilroy Cemetery to complete this cemetery paperwork or to make arrangement at the cemetery, that doesn't cost anything. So when you get a bill from Leicester City Council, it'll have 3 very specific charges, 2 definitely, possibly 3. The first will be for the grave that you've chosen, whether it's lawned or traditional. The second will be what they call the interment fee, the interring of the body. So basically opening up the grave, the cost involved in opening the grave and closing the grave. That's the cemetery staff cost, interment fee. And the third possible fee that you might get charged is what we call the chapel fee. Now, if you go to the cemetery, you'll see we've got a place where we place Salatul Janazah. That falls under the chapel category. So we call it the Janazgah. So there'll be a charge for the Janazgah. On average, I'll leave this piece of paper here for you to look at, but that's got all the breakdowns in it. The grave is, as I mentioned, 1,235 or 2,320. The interment fee is a fixed 710, which goes up. All these prices go up every 1st of April, by the way. So the grave is 1,235 or 2,320. The interment fee is 710. And the chapel fee, if you use the chapel, is 125. Right? Those 3 added up. This category, this pricing, is for Leicester residents. So if you are not a Leicester resident, then you will automatically be charged a non-resident fee. In a non-resident fee, all the first two figures are doubled. So if you had a loaned grave for a non-resident, it will be 1, 2, 3, 5 twice. So 2,470. The interment fee, 710, that's doubled. 1420. The janazah fee is not, whether you use it or not. So if you are a non-resident, so a non-resident could be anybody who's outside of Leicester City, could be from Scotland or from Oadby. It's a non-resident. And what they do is when you complete the funeral form, they cross-reference the details that you put in on the funeral form as an applicant, the deceased details rather, against the electoral register. And if you don't appear on the electoral register, or the deceased doesn't appear on the electoral register, automatically the applicant is charged a double fee. You have to then, excuse me, if they were not, a lot of our people are not registered for voting. So in such circumstances, you would need to provide GP records to say this person resided at this particular address, or pension papers, or whatever it is. As long as the council has proof that this person lived there within the city boundary, you'll be fine.
So in terms of, when a death happens, the contact MBCOL, how far do you guys go? Do you stay as well as after the death and also the burial, or do you just stop at the burial?
One of the bits that Suman Bhai mentioned was the cost of resourcing. Okay, in the past we had ample funds to provide all of these services fi sabilillah. It's become increasingly difficult. So the board has, with the membership's approval, decided that for where appropriate, a service fee will be applied if the family is happy for the burial council to facilitate their funeral or manage the whole funeral, which is from the word go. So as soon as somebody passes away, the family would contact us and say, look, can you do everything for us, please? Because we don't know what needs to be done, or we don't have the manpower or the people to do it. We would then make arrangements for you to signpost you really to get the death certificate in place, make an appointment for you at the registrars, make arrangements for the body to be collected, take it to a facility of your choice or the family's choice for the ghusl, kafan and so on. Make arrangements for you to come to the MBCOL office or Giro Cemetery for the cemetery arrangements. Take the body to the family home or a place of your choice before the funeral. Take the body from there to the cemetery and get the burial done. So basically manage your whole funeral for you for just a fee to cover the costs. That's all. And that can be anything from £50 to £100 to £150. It just depends on how much work is involved, really. Jian.
I'm a retired GP. Retired from Nottingham 7 years ago. As brother said, you got a very good rapport with the coroner. They are very helpful normally. Yeah. If you give them the proper information about the patient, they will avoid post-mortem or anything. Once I had a patient, they were very desperate. I knew the patient very well, and it was a genuine, I can support the genuine causes of the death. And the coroner I had to report because it was kind of sudden death. You know the circumstances, the health, the diseases, or everything in place, but we have to report the coroner. And coroner was in Spain. I got hold of his phone number. I spoke to him in Spain, and I explained him the explanation. He gave me the guidelines that this is certificate I'm issuing is supported by the coroner. So they are very helpful if you give them the proper. Yeah. The other thing is about the GP. I remained single-handed GP for almost 30 years. I knew my patients very well. I never refused to visit elderly people. So I had no problem, notes backed up by hospital investigation. So virtually my patient, only 1 to 5% had post-mortem, unless they died in the hospital. Sure. And that's for sudden.
The coroner we have here, like Suman Bhai explained, the coroner and the deputy coroners remain on call for us out of hours, which is one thing I didn't mention. But they will only talk to they'll only talk to people in a very structured way. They won't just entertain calls from anybody. So it's usually a representative of MBCOL will make contact with the coroner to say we've got a bit of a situation and we need some guidance. So even on a weekend or a bank holiday, we have access to the coroner, but we're with very limited amount of work because, they need to be in the office to provide a lot of support, but they can provide a lot of assistance outside the office as well. So mashallah, in Leicester, we do enjoy the benefit of having access to the coroner on weekdays and on weekends and bank holidays as well.
Alhamdulillah, as Dr. Saab said, in Birmingham, especially when somebody in Birmingham, the rule is if anybody is admitted into hospital within 24 hours, that person dies, it has to automatically be referred to the coroner regardless of anything.
Okay.
Now what we do is we ask the family to go to the GP because the ambulance people only got a few lines. They only when they refer the case to the coroner, I've seen it myself, they only put chest pain, heart attack. They just refer with only 2 lines. Now, when that case goes to the coroner's office, they got no medical records or nothing to go by. So what we do in Birmingham is in cases like those, or even somebody sudden death at home or something like that, we ask the GP to send a brief medical record to the coroner's office before the coroner even pick up the case, so that when they get the case, they can make an informed decision that, this was terminally ill or they had issues beforehand. That speeds up the process.
Yeah. Here in Leicester, mashallah, it's the other way around. The coroner makes those calls. So as soon as they get a death which is referred to them, the first thing the coroner's officers will do is they'll look at the EMAS records, which is the ambulance records, and then they'll pick up the phone and speak to the surgery if they feel that they can get somewhere. They'll pursue any avenue to avoid a post-mortem. But this work that you've mentioned, which your GP does, is actually done by the coroner. The coroner makes the calls. Because quite often the GPs, with no disrespect, some can be a bit lazy and difficult, and perhaps their surgery demands a lot of work from them and they don't have time. So sometimes it can be difficult. But the other way around, the GPs will surgeries will almost always take a call from the coroner's office, and they'll patch it through no matter what the GP is doing, so we can get somewhere through with that system, mashallah.
Sometimes I think the difficulty is we have spoken a number of times to doctors' forums. They have their own forums where they discuss various new drugs, etc., and we've made presentation to them. I'm very sad to say that in many of those cases where we have asked the doctors who are all present, it's unfortunate that the ones from our community are the ones who take the objection and say, no, you just want us to be available 24 hours a day. And many non-Muslim doctors are more accommodating. That's not to say they're better, because nobody can be better than Muslim. We're not into a theological debate about it. But there are some GPs that I have come across in doctors' forums that I've spoken about this particular issue who feel that we're putting too much pressure on them to make them available, and whereas others would say, well, look, it's a perfect, reasonable request that you are making, and we're prepared to help you. So there's a cultural change that also needs to be made within our own community. We have one or two good doctors in Leicester from the Muslim community. So I'm not putting it right across the board, but by and large, of the 2 doctors' forum that I've spoken to, it has been, unfortunately, our people who stand up and start objecting that you are putting too much pressure on us. So that's sad, but there we are. But inshallah, Allah give everybody hidayat that to move forward to try and help the people.
You mentioned about the 2 different costs in the cemetery. I didn't get the second. The one is the loan cemetery.
The loan section. So our section, our new section is broken down into 2 parts. A small section, which we call the traditional section. It's entirely separate. And that has traditional graves, which is the English traditional graves, which curb sets and plants and monuments. And the other is more in line with Islamic approach to it, which is what we call the lawned. That takes up almost 90% of it, I would think, Adam Bhai. About 90% of the section would be lawned.
So the lawn cemetery grave is
1,235.
And the other one?
2,320.
And what do you call the other one?
Traditional.
Traditional.
but not traditional in the Islamic sense, traditional in the Western sense. This is where the confusion normally happens to people. So Western says traditional. English, exactly, with curbstones and monuments and everything.
When families come to us, one of the things that we have to do is, and we did the same, I think, for your...
But what is the difference between traditional and...
The traditional grave is more, it can have curb sets, edgings, it can have plants, it can have shrubs, it can have decoration. No matter what you want, you can basically do there. Yeah. And the reason why they charge you more is over the years, it'll take more time to maintain that grave than a lawn grave. The lawn grave is just flat grass with a headstone, and it's just easy to maintain.
Okay, because we have a big issue.
But here we have to show applicants pictures of both graves and explain what I've just explained with the cost for them to make a decision, because once you decide on a section, you can't reverse it.
So in terms of, you've explained the new process of getting a grave, or also in terms of when death happens. But suppose someone has actually previously had a plot or something like that. How do you go around with that?
Previously had a?
So suppose if someone bought some sort of land and their desires to actually...
Our cemetery has the land where you as an individual can go on Monday to the cemetery department and buy a plot if you wanted one for your family. We've got many, many families and investors who have reserved plots. So it's not that Islamically, it's not appropriate for us to think that, no, this is for me. It's a family plot, so it makes the whole life easier. Sometimes it's just, cheaper to buy a plot now than to buy in 10 years. For example, 10 years ago, the plots were like 600, 700 pounds. Today, they're 12, 1,300 pounds. So you can see the saving if you have a plot in advance. And it could be, the intention should be, if you do decide to reserve a grave, is for anybody within your family to be buried there, should burial be required. That would be the appropriate intention if you were to buy a grave, okay? Not specifically for you or a specific individual, because you don't know where that person's last breath will be.
Being buried around it and dug around it.
So what happens is that grave, once you apply and pay for it, will be reserved in that individual's name. Not necessarily for that individual to be buried there, but you have to put a name to it. So it could be an individual's name. Now, all the other burials will take place around it. The only downside to this is, the upside is you save money, and it's one headache off your mind. The downside is that if that plot is to be used in, say, 10 years' time, when everything else around it is used up, there could be a delay in digging it. So what they have to then do is hand dig the grave. Now, at the moment, they would use machinery to dig a grave. It can be done in 15 minutes. Okay, to hand dig could take anything up to 6 hours, depending on which time of year it is. But in winter, it's frozen, so it takes longer. The other downside is, if you lose the deed to that grave, then you won't be able to use that plot on a weekend or a bank holiday, because the offices will be shut for them to verify that you are indeed the grave owner. So you can only use that grave if you lost the deed on a weekday. So if you do end up reserving a grave, and you do unfortunately end up losing your deed, the first thing you need to do is go back to the cemetery department and get them to issue a fresh deed. Okay? But the whole process is not any easier by buying a grave. So don't go buying graves tomorrow to make things. It doesn't make things easier. In fact, buying a grave at the time of burial is actually easier, because it's just a straight allocation. The other way, you'd have to give me the deed, I would have to verify the deed, send scans of the deed to the grave diggers, and so on and so on, and then deal with the problem of perhaps being able to use the grave or not, that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily easier.
And there's another problem as well, because if individual jamaats get together and they buy a large section of the cemetery, then the people presently who need that burial space won't have it, because they'll have purchased all the graves. So can you understand, we are doing a disservice to our Muslim brothers and sisters who may need it at the time. So we have to think a bit logically about it as well.
Before we move on, the council will not permit organisation to bulk buy graves at all. You have to go as an individual, provide residency proof, and then...
So in light of that, would it be sensible to say that if a person has got a genuine concern, that you should set aside £3,000 to £4,000?
Yes.
And that
would be
maybe
sensible.
Even write that in his will and say that is £3,000 from my savings that's going to be allocated to that. Obviously.
Yeah. I mean, Sheikh Manjub will probably explain
Exactly.
the intricacies of writing that part of that portion within the will. But to answer a lot of inquiries we get, people generally ask, how much would I need? I would say to you today, I would have roughly 3,000. If you're a city resident, have roughly £2,500 put aside for a funeral. And drop for a traditional one, then you would put another £1,200-1,300 on top. Okay? And throw in another £1,500 every year to allow for the increment, right? And just keep that in a separate budget. You can let your family know if you want, or friends know that, look, I've allowed for my funeral and this is the budget you need to go on, and I'll put it in a will even. So you can take precautions like that. That would be good advice.
Okay, before we take our next question, just listen to that.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
Jibai.
Do you have any facility for a dead person if he's very destitute, very poor, and can't afford the expenses of burial?
Yes, we do. Hafiz Abu, sitting by the pillar there, is our secretary from the Burial Council, and he usually deals with destitute funerals, we call them, where sometimes we get immigrants, refugees who have not been settled here for too long, low-income families perhaps who can't afford funerals. And his job would be to actually speak to the family, vet them, because we have to make our checks and make inquiries and so on. And if they qualify, then Hafiz Sahib will then take that responsibility. And we've got, mashallah, a few well-wishers, wealthy well-wishers who've come to Hafiz Sahib and said, if there are situations such as that, please contact us and then we'll make arrangements. So yes, we do have that.
It is important, one, for those that have benefit system, there is a system within the benefit system for this. These are people who are not entitled to any benefit. Also, the money that we collect, usually, I think within 15-20 minutes we manage to collect, sending a message out, but we only collect up to the penny that is required. So, example, there is £5 left to cover up, and somebody comes to the office with £10, we'll give the £5 change back again, because we do not hold anything extra. They say for the next funeral, no, because if the intention was for that funeral, we can only up to the penny hold that, and the rest of the money is returned back to the donors again, because it's an amana, we can't hold on to it. But it's only happened, I think, 3 or 4 times, and every time it's been very quick.
One thing I must mention before we move on is where you are applying to the state for funeral, to cover funeral expenses, always have to remember that the person who passed away If they were entitled, then their benefits cease as soon as they pass away. So you can't base your application on the fact that the deceased was in receipt of funds. The person who is applying on their behalf, and the category is that they have to be a husband, a partner basically, son, grandson, daughter, that kind of qualification, blood relative. They would be the applicant, and they would then apply. If they were receiving benefits themselves, they would apply to what the government has labeled the funeral fund. You can Google it and read the criteria for it. So the funeral fund is what you would apply for. If you're a new arrival and you weren't in receipt of any funds at all, or the applicant isn't, then unfortunately you don't have any other choice but to come to the community to
Yes. Can I reserve the grave for some of my family or friends who is out of Leicester? And what would be the procedure for the
if you had a grave that you had reserved, like the brother asked, so he'd go there Monday and reserve a grave. Each individual is allocated one grave. So if you had 2 adults in your family, you could go husband and wife and reserve a grave for each individual. That plot is your property for that set period, 50 years or whatever it is, and then you can extend it from then on. But basically you are the owner of that grave. What you do with that grave is nobody's concern. Whether you give it to a resident, a non-resident, it's entirely up to you. So if you had a non-resident, you could say, look, that my relative was visiting from abroad and has passed away. I want them to be buried in this particular grave. That saving will be there. But the interment fee element of that will be doubled for a non-resident. So that still applies. You'll save on the land, but you'll still have to pay on that.
Someone is like in London or Gloucester or somewhere, what would be the procedure for transferring the bodies?
All they would need to do is they would need to acquire the death certificate where they stay, where they passed away. They would need to register that death in that jurisdiction. So every part of the country is broken down into jurisdictions. So that individual, say they died in London, right? They would need to register the death in London. They would need to get the burial order. Once they've got the burial order, we can then transport the body from London to Leicester, and make arrangements with that burial order for the burial to take place here. So that can all be done. But if you're asking me specifically about grave, then you can give that individual your grave and say, I want this person to be buried there. Yes, you can do that.
Except if you take the body out of the country, then you have to get a coroner's permission. Within the country, it's okay. Out of the country, coroner's permission is required.
That's what they call it out of England. Sorry, brothers asked a few times. For headstones and grave markings, you can make, there are a few individuals that we have, companies that we can recommend, and you can apply to them for a headstone and so on. Whenever burial takes place, you can put up a temporary sign. So you can make up a makeshift kind of sign at home, place it on a grave or a grave marker.